Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 4 of GEA UWS Spotlight. I am your host, Joe Cleary. The first 3 episodes of GEA UWS Spotlight have featured future players for the GEA UWS team, but this episode we are changing directions, and we have a guest who is providing the GEA UWS team with a way to improve their performances on and off the field. My guest today is Noah Rolland. Noah is the president of NeuroTrainer, and for over 20 years, he has led the development of innovative fitness brands and human performance technology. NeuroTrainer is the first cognitive priming and optimization system that combines virtual reality and proven neuroscience to train and augment peak performance. I know I said a lot of big words there, but we're definitely going to dive into those and get more explanations from Noah himself. Noah is incredibly hands-on with his approach to being president of the NeuroTrainer, which we love, and we are lucky to have him on today. Welcome, Noah, to the GEA UWS Spotlight Show. Thank you for coming on the show. Excited to have you on the show, and I'm looking forward to sharing with our audience more about NeuroTrainer and the type of impact it can have on the game of soccer.
Thanks, Joe. It's a pleasure to be here. And yeah, those are big words, but we're happy to break them down.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what we want to do for our audience, and hopefully for me too a little bit, even though this is something I've been interested in and studied. I always need a refresher course. So first, we'll just jump right into it if that's okay with you.
Of course.
In my research for this interview, I read a couple newspaper articles, saw a couple video clips, and then got to experience the NeuroTrainer myself, and we had an off-air conversation last week. But NeuroTrainer has been used by several other sports and other organizations, including the Coast Guard. I've seen it's been featured on major news outlets and technology platforms. How did NeuroTrainer exactly get its start?
Sure. So NeuroTrainer is really the passion project of our founder, Jeff Nyquist. And Jeff is our chief scientist. And 16 years ago, Jeff was doing his PhD work at Vanderbilt University. And for those of us who have been interested in the brain and interested in brain science, and for me, prior to NeuroTrainer, I was not a neuroscientist. I'm still not, and I don't play one on TV. But I've always been really interested in the brain, like yourself, and really interested in brain training. So about 16 years ago was sort of the heyday of brain science, because the evolution of the theory of neuroplasticity became really prevalent. And neuroplasticity in its simplest form just means we can train the brain very deliberately, and we can train the brain in alignment with our goals. And so Jeff started on some research projects that really excited him and led him to see the viability of being able to use science to help people shape their brains and train their brains in a way that was really meaningful to them, and then continued to pursue that over time. And that's really how we got to NeuroTrainer. The goal was always to take neuroscience out of the lab and be able to port it so that it can come into the living room, into the locker room, onto the playing field. And we feel very fortunate that technology's allowed us to do that at this point.
Yeah, it was new to me, and how easy it was to just get started right away with it, like just jump right into the headset. What do you said it can come into the locker room and onto the field. What type of impact do you think that it could have on the game of soccer as well as other sports?
Sure. Well, this is our favorite topic, right? And this is only what I talk about 7 days a week. So let's talk about the science, and then let's talk about NeuroTrainer specifically. So this idea that you can really train your brain is so powerful and so important to athletes, because what really unlocks elite level performance is what happens above your neck. And we've spoken to high school athletes, as you said. We work with college athletes, pro athletes. I remember we were working with one of the big skill trainers in basketball, in professional basketball, and we were looking at some video of different players that he works with, and he said, look, at the end of the day, everybody who's in the NBA, their skill level is this close. They're really this close to one another. What sets them apart is what they do inside their heads and how they manage their brain. And so some of that is around, how do you prepare for events? Can we optimize your brain so that the moment you walk onto the field, you're in peak performance? And we'll probably talk about that a little bit. But some of it is also, how can we train the brain long term? So we've been able to demonstrate, and I don't know how geeky we want to get into the science, so you'll have to be my guide rail. But we've demonstrated, for instance, we did a pretty big study with professional baseball, that we're able to improve decision-making speed as an acute measurement. We're able to improve decision-making speed by somewhere between 40 and 50 milliseconds, depending on how long somebody trains with us. So just as an aside, in my life, 50 milliseconds isn't that important unless I'm in an emergency situation. But you can imagine 50 milliseconds if you're a softball or a baseball player, 50 milliseconds if you're a goalie in soccer, 50 milliseconds if you're about to pass or you're about to try to score is critical. And so there's several different cognitive measures and cognitive skills that we know we can impact and we can improve.
Yeah, and we've talked about this in sports all the time, is that everyone works hard. And like you said, that trainer said, everyone's this close, like everyone's right there, but the best find a way to do more or to do it better than everyone else. And they say it's a little thing, but I think when it comes to your brain, this is quite a big thing. And so kind of the next couple of questions, we're going to break down a little bit I'll get into a little bit of the science and
Great.
kind of, a big part of what I mentioned in the introduction was cognitive priming. And I think that unless you've studied in that realm, you're not going to know what that is. So can you kind of describe what is cognitive priming and then how it can help athletes?
Yeah, absolutely. So cognitive priming, I think the best way to think about this, and this is the way I often approach it, is we think about how, and earlier you mentioned I've been playing in this world for 20 plus years. So I think about 20 years ago, or even if we go further back, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, when an athlete, and let's take a high school athlete, when a high school athlete was getting ready to go out on the field, what was warm up back then? And my answer is always, you put on your shoes, right? And so as you were bending over and putting your shoes on, you hoped that you maybe stretched your hamstrings. And then, okay, you ready to go? Great, let's go. And we're out and we're on the field. And now over the decades, we've focused so much on the importance of preparing before we get to performance. So when we look at athletes before practice, we look at athletes before games, what are they doing? They're doing mobility work. They're doing dynamic warm-ups so that they're increasing their respiration. They're increasing their cardiovascular activity. And there's actually chemical changes that are associated with that are really important. What we always ask is, what are you doing to your brain? What are you doing to warm up your brain? So think of cognitive priming really as a brain warm up. What are you doing to warm up your brain so that the moment you step on the court or the moment you step on the field, not only is your body ready, but your brain is ready. And so we can literally, through kind of the magic of virtual reality and neuroscience, we can invigorate the regions of the brain, the areas of the brain that are responsible for peak performance, and we can get athletes into a peak performance state faster. Now, there's a couple different ways to prime, but I think we'll start there because it's a really easy concept to get.
Yeah, no, that's a great breakdown for it. And on screen, you can see now some of our future GEA UWS players and current Nebraska Husker athletes experiencing NeuroTrainer inside the Oculus, and Reagan Robbie, who's one of the most fantastic players that we've seen play in Nebraska, getting frustrated herself at the NeuroTrainer, and we'll talk a little bit about.
Yeah, frustration is going to be an important element as we explore this together,
and we'll get into that. So the next key term that and important thing that I want to talk about with audiences, which I think is a very important subject, not just in athletics but in general, is the idea and the term of what neuroplasticity is.
Yeah.
And then how neuroplasticity directly relates to what NeuroTrainer does.
Yeah, great. So there's a lot of mystery around neuroplasticity. It's become a very popular term these days, and whenever a term becomes popular, it gets really confusing because everybody becomes a neuroplasticity expert.
Yep, and that's why I think that's why I wanted to ask this question, because you see it in BuzzFeed articles, you see it on Twitter, but sometimes you don't see it from the people who actually know what they're talking about.
Right, and sometimes it's, if you take this supplement, you'll increase your neuroplasticity. Orange juice improves your neuroplasticity. Right. So the whole idea of neuroplasticity is that the brain is always looking for ways of establish new neural networks and to change. And as I referenced, the theory for years was that neuroplasticity had an endpoint in age, that you got to like age 25 and your brain was mapped, and that was it. And then from there on out, we're out of luck. Like, it's much harder to learn things, which is true, and it's much harder to adapt to new skills. But the research shows that neuroplasticity takes place, continues to take place all the time, and so it's always happening. And this is what's interesting. And so there are events, there are conditions that lead to a higher level of neuroplasticity. So one example outside of the headset is a very, very high level of drive, a very high level of desire, or a need creates this chemical cocktail in the brain that helps to establish neuroplasticity. So what does that mean? It's the receptivity to learning. So in sport, we think of it as skill acquisition. So What we do in NeuroTrainer, and we saw a little bit of that frustration out on the court, is we have a skill. So we call our training station skills. We have a skill that's specifically designed to help increase the likelihood of neuroplasticity, or what we call a neuroplastic event. So when somebody's doing that skill, which is called PADL, it's an acronym PADL for the perception action decision loop. They're going to go through a series of exercises that are visual and physical. We're going to have them we're going to have them look based on a cue. We're going to have them react to balls. We're going to have them dodge balls. And as we're doing this, we're trying to do several different things. We're trying to increase their overall state of alertness. We're trying to increase and stimulate some sense of focus, because those are sort of the two precursors. And what's happening in the brain is the brain's starting to produce more adrenaline. And in the brain, it's called epinephrine. So more adrenaline, your metabolic process starts speeding up. As you focus, the brain starts to produce more acetylcholine. And what really drives this whole process, and if all of us sit down and we think about our best learning experiences, there's got to be a little bit of frustration in there. Frustration actually enhances the likelihood of neuroplasticity. So when we see a video like that and we see an athlete throw up their arms, we think that's awesome, as long as it's framed correctly, because we want to get to a certain level of frustration and a certain level of success. So by the end of this paddle session, which runs about 8 minutes, 12 minutes, depending on what you're doing, you're really primed for learning. And at that point, we want you to take the headset off and get out into the field and start working your skills drills. So I mentioned earlier, there's different ways to prime based on what you're doing. So there's priming for peak performance. I'm going to go out and I'm going to do what I already know how to do. I'm going to get into a state of flow. And then there's priming for learning. And of course, it's any type of learning, but in this case, it would be improving your physical skills.
Yeah, and I'm having flashbacks now, looking at paddle, and this is
paddle flashbacks.
Like, yeah, this is where I'm learning a lot more too. Even though we went through this, last week, here I am sitting here thinking that it's called paddle because you hit things with the paddle,
right.
And it actually has a really good acronym
right.
with it. But just so users are aware, this is what it looks like, and then part of the training too is there's more than just the ball coming at you and then you having to hit it in a direction. There's sometimes there's numbers on the ball, and that you have to hit it in the specific direction to the number of robots in relation to that. And you can't hit it into the red robot. You have to hit it into the blue robot. And so there's a lot of nuances to it. And it is incredibly frustrating. And it's funny because I got it right away and I thought I was being really good until I got off of paddle and Noah told me, yeah, initially we make it so that there's like an 80% success rate, which made me not feel as good.
Well, and that's the balance we're looking for, right? We want you to be, so we think of frustration as a really positive thing. And so we even imagine a time in the future in our product where when you're making errors, because you saw, let's talk a little bit about VR and how cool VR is, right? Because this is part of what makes NeuroTrainer. Yeah. So not only are you doing all those things you described, Joe, but we're sort of the evil masterminds in the background because we can manipulate all of those factors, and we do. So you said there'll be dots on the balls. Well, sometimes they're dots. Sometimes they're hashtags. Sometimes the balls spin. Sometimes the balls don't spin. Sometimes the balls spin very quickly. So there's a sequence of events. That's what PADL means. It's perception, action, decision loops. So the first one is I see a spinning ball. I have to head check in the direction of that ball. So we'll take that one example. We can control the speed of the spin. So as you get better, we make it more challenging. So the VR environment is constantly adaptive. And I think that's what makes NeuroTrainer so powerful, is the ability to leverage these deeply immersive environments. And the Oculus Quest allows us to do this in a really convincing way. But then to create an environment that's adaptive to the person. So every time you go in, you might do the same thing, but the experience is actually going to be different.
And then it kind of, and then this is where your brain acts very similar to your body in the sense of a lot of people who are in maybe the strength and conditioning world are familiar with the strength and conditioning world. It's always like the SAID principle, specified demands onto the body and changing those to keep, your body guessing and keep it growing. And that's similar. I'm guessing that's what's similar with the brain as well.
It's similar. It's similar with the brain, and again, it varies on what you're trying to achieve. So when we talk about what we're going to be doing together in this application for soccer, we're going to be using our two different skills according to what's the team going to be doing. So on the days that the team are going to be playing a game, they're going to do what we call attention flow. And we're all familiar with flow. So flow, getting in the zone, being locked in, these all refer to those same things. Every athlete has had this experience where you put out your best performance, but it was like easy. How did I do that? I scored 12 goals and I never felt like I was doing anything. I've never scored 12 goals, but imagine it's like that. So if you're training to get into flow, we actually don't want you to be that frustrated. When you're training to get into flow, we adjust the difficulty, and this is what you were referring to a moment ago. So you always get about 80% of the tasks that you're doing correct, because flow requires that you challenge the brain, that you get into a deep state of focus. But can I go a little bit further in the science for just a minute?
Yeah, let's do it.
So flow, from a neurocognitive perspective, is called transient hypofrontality. I feel like we should put those words up on the wall. Transient hypofrontality. So what does that mean? It means that when we walk around on a daily basis, the front of our brain, the prefrontal of our conscious thought, and most of the time that works for us, but sometimes it works against us. And this is true of athletes at every level. Self-doubt, self-criticism. It's why so much mental skills training is about positive self-talk and visualization. So what flow, transient hypofrontality is we actually quiet the prefrontal cortex. So we put you in this multi-object tracking task. So you see 10 balls floating in front of you. We identify 2 of them. We say you need to track these 2 balls. They all turn the same color and the balls start to move in a random order. At the end of 8 seconds, we identify 2 balls, and then we say pick the one you were tracking. And you have to choose, you're forced to choose, and you try to pick the one that you were tracking. It's conceptually very simple. But then, because it's VR, we can change everything: the speed of the balls, the range, the visual range, so we can expand the visual challenge, so you really start to work your peripheral vision. And then we start to throw in distractions. But during all of that, we're constantly adapting, so you get about 80% of every round correct, because that's key to flow. And so when you're priming for peak performance, you want to get to that point where you feel like, okay, I'm really not thinking anymore. These other parts of my brain, the visual cortex and the parietal lobe, they're processing tons of information, and they can do it at very high speeds. And I can sense it. I feel like I'm in the zone. I'm just getting questions right, and I feel great. So that's one way to approach it. And then when we talk about the frustration piece, that's this other element of, okay, no, I really need to learn something. Yeah. I want to increase the likelihood that that's going to happen. So there's slightly different formulas and slightly different applications.
Yep. And then we use the learning phase when we're not during the non-game days, during the training and the practice days.
Exactly.
And then, so that kind of dovetails into my next question. You know, we talked a little bit ago how about you could improve your neuroplasticity doing this, you could take these supplements, blah, blah, blah. And so there might be someone who goes, well, why are you saying these things may not work or may not do what we want them to do, but NeuroTrainer does? But I think that you've had some results. So what are some results that NeuroTrainer users have seen that you maybe have been able to document?
Sure. So you mentioned earlier, we work with a broad range of athletes from really high school through college, pro, and now we're doing some work with the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Defense. We get similar feedback all the way through. So we're very careful. We're very honest, and we're very careful. When we talk about evidence, it shows up in different ways. And proof is just a sketchy word. It can mean so many things to so many people. Yep. So let's
in today's day and age.
Yeah, really. So let's walk through what we've heard. So when we get to evidence, we talk about collecting data inside the headset and then correlating that to performance on the field or on the court. So we've had some really interesting success, I mentioned earlier, with professional baseball, where we're able to see improvements inside the headset translating into plate discipline, improved plate discipline. Early on, it was in what we were gunning for really was looking to increase O-swing percentage. So better accuracy on what do I swing at? And so that really ties into our go, no go, or executive decision making overall, perception. We've worked with some professional soccer teams. We worked with a soccer team. This one was interesting because they took our data and their data and they did a data analysis on their own. We didn't actually know what they were doing. And they came back and they showed us an analysis that over time, and they had a group that had used NeuroTrainer and a group that hadn't, that the group that had used NeuroTrainer had a 1.5% improvement or increase in successful pass percentages. And then they extracted that into what this would look like over an entire season is 3 more wins.
Wow.
So it sounds small, but when it aggregates, it becomes gigantic.
Well, there's so many seasons in soccer that if you tell a coach that they can get 3 more wins, for a coach, that's the difference between sometimes keeping your job and losing your job. And for a lot of teams, that's the difference between making the playoffs, not making the playoffs, winning the championship, not winning the championship. And knowing where soccer's going, being data analyst driven or analysis driven, even with the GEA UWS team, we're going to be breaking down our games. It makes total sense that NeuroTrainer has been able to see positive upticks in results applicable to the sports that they're being used in.
Yeah, to be clear, that's a lot of work. To get to that level of data analysis is a lot of work. Most high schools don't do it. Honestly, a lot of colleges don't do it. So there's that level of rigor. But I also just want to talk about what I think is equally important is what do the athletes say? And so we call that social proof. And so we have athletes who report back, and it's a consistent message, but it varies a little bit. Athletes talk about feeling locked in faster. They feel like I walk out on the court and I'm ready to go. Like here's an interesting story. COVID, you may have heard of COVID, obviously changed everybody's business, everybody's lives. And what we saw were a lot of athletes were no longer on the court or on the field. And so they started using NeuroTrainer as a way of getting some training in. What edge can I get now when I can't do some of the physical training? And then as things started to ease, we started to get inbound, and it was really interesting, inbound feedback from a couple of our athletes. I'll use two examples. We had a volleyball athlete in Omaha, very, very successful volleyball player, who reached out to us and said, normally when I take a break and I go back to play, it takes me sometimes 2 or 3 days to feel like my timing is right on the court. And I felt like my timing was right the moment I stepped on the court. We're like, oh, that's interesting. It's a data point of 1, but it's really interesting. So NeuroTrainer is helping you maintain or improve your timing, even though you're not doing your sport. But then we get an inbound call from a professional baseball player. And his story was, I hadn't been in front of a professional baseball pitcher in almost 60 days. It's a pretty intimidating moment when you get in front of a fastball for the first time. He said, it was like I never left the game. I picked up the ball immediately and I was back on the ball. So we look for evidence in all of its different forms, but we think those kind of feedback points from athletes are as important as the data that we can cull over time.
Well, and just talking about, coming back into a game after being out for 60 days, we're going to talk a little bit about injuries in a little bit later, but that's going to be incredibly important for athletes coming as they come back from injuries. And I guess before we move on to the injury piece of it and kind of what the technology is going to do over time, just even outside of sports, what are some things other than using NeuroTrainer? Do you have some, in your experience and the individuals you've worked with, do you have some tips, advice, or actionable things that athletes, parents, our listening audience in general can do to support their own optimal cognitive functioning?
Of course. Yeah, absolutely. It would be funny if my answer was no. No, it's NeuroTrainer or nothing, folks. You're out of luck. There are some very basic things that we all need to be paying attention to because it's all part of an equation, and we're very aware of that. So let's talk about just neuroplasticity by itself. So when somebody's in the headset, we're trying to enhance this likelihood of neuroplasticity, but that's not when it takes place. Neuroplasticity, so what happens is when you get to this peak state of alertness and this peak state of the right level of frustration, is the brain is almost painting the neurons that are active, and it's saying, okay, these are the neurons, these are the neural networks that need to get reinforced. That reinforcement takes place at night. That reinforcement takes place when you sleep. So if you're not guarding your sleep, if you're not getting enough sleep, and there's another way of getting to that point, it's called non-sleep deep rest. If you're not getting enough deep rest or sleep, all of the neurotraining in the world, any supplements, anything you're doing to try to enhance neuroplasticity isn't going to work very well or at all. So we always say number one is you've really got to guard your sleep, and you have to have good, what they call now, sleep hygiene. I think the other one that's really accessible for a lot of people is learning how to control your breathing, because breathing is really the gateway to your autonomic nervous system. It's your gateway to be able to control your state of arousal and your state of passivity. So we saw it, and you had this experience. You're inside paddle starts to get frustrating. We've had people start to sweat. We've had people with heart rate monitors on that are like, I can't believe I got into this zone. And we want you to have some sense and some feeling of that, but at the same time, we watch people. What we see is they stop breathing, and so we create an environment. they hold their breath. And so we create an environment where you kind of mimic that level of intensity that you get on the field, but without the pressure of your peers, without the pressure of your coach. So there's an opportunity inside the headset and everywhere else to really take control of your breath. Notice your state and adjust with your breath. Very often it's I'm too worked up. And so slow, deep breaths, or even there's a breath cycle where you take 2 quick inhalations and 1 exhalation that immediately activates the parasympathetic nervous system and calms you down. There are examples where people need to increase their level of stimulation, and you can do that with faster breaths. You can kind of hyper oxygenate the breath. So I always go to breathing and sleep as the first 2 places when you're really looking at how do I take care of my brain and as it relates to my performance.
Yeah, and that's
Is
very
this the man
helpful.
himself? Is that
Yeah,
what we're
this
seeing
is
right
me.
here?
This is me, and that's
Looking good.
yeah, yeah.
Look at that. Look at that head dodge.
Luckily, I didn't head dodge right into the concrete wall there. But I think that's the important thing is in sports, we're always talking about we talk about obviously the athletic side of thing, like the weightlifting and the conditioning, and then one of the new wave things was talking about sports psychology, like you brought
Mhm.
up earlier, positive self-talk, and then the next wave of things was like, oh, you got to make sure you check out your lifestyle, which you just talked about there,
Mhm.
and that's why those 3 things are all important. I'm glad that those things can also feed into what you do with NeuroTrainer, but NeuroTrainer also feeds positively into all 3 of those things.
Mhm.
And that's what I find interesting is we're adding another component to the possibility of being more successful as an athlete, but also, and we'll get into this a little bit more, possibly more as just an individual and as a student and as
100%.
as an employee. So into the injury side of things a little bit. And I don't know if there's a really good answer to this, but like injuries are common in the sport of soccer, like many sports. And unfortunately, concussions, especially in the women's game, are highly prevalent.
Mhm.
I know that there has been some research done on dementia and Alzheimer's and how NeuroTrainer could possibly affect those. But what about traumatic brain injuries that may occur in sport or even
Sure.
in military service or accidents? Do you think, or has there been any research about NeuroTrainer being used positively for recovery or for TBI recovery?
Mhm.
Can you
No,
speak
it's a
on that a little bit?
yeah, it's a great question. I can speak on it a little bit,
Okay.
not because I'm holding back, but just because, again, we want to be very careful when we talk about the appropriate uses of neurotrainers today versus in the future.
Right.
So we have been consistently. We have a partner at the University of Rochester, and we've been doing clinical studies now for a couple of years, looking at neurotrainer and its relationship to TBI. You mentioned Alzheimer's disease as well as age-related cognitive decline. And so we hope to be publishing in a journal later this summer, maybe a little bit later, that really looks at neurotrainers' ability to impact concussion recovery. And so the evidence, the early evidence is very positive, and we're very excited about it. But we kind of keep it in the area of neurotrainer labs. And when we look at our product roadmap, right now we're very focused on sport. But as you've alluded to, that's where neurotrainer is today. And when we look at growth opportunities, we absolutely look at TBI and the ability to help people recover from brain injuries over time. We currently don't advocate for that usage, and it's a very different protocol than an athlete protocol.
Yeah, and I think that's what I appreciated from our conversation last week and also conversation right now is we're learning a lot about neurotrainer and cognitive priming and neuroplasticity, but there's no outrageous like thing that what we can do and can't do with this. And I think that's important because the brain, we talked about this off air, the brain's a delicate thing. And it's been affected quite a bit by technology. And we talked about it last week as
Yeah, let's
well
talk about that.
with
Yeah,
we got Instagram and TikTok and Twitter and everything else and social media and just screens in general have changed our life and our society in
right,
general over the last 30, 40, 50 years whenever television first came into existence and became
right.
really really mainstream. um but we're able to use NeuroTrainer, which is technology in itself, to combat
Yeah,
the negative that
antidote
comes.
to the technology evil,
Yeah,
right? Yeah,
which is very like not crazy, but it's just very you wouldn't think that would
it's
be how that
counterintuitive.
would work. Yeah,
Well,
counterintuitive. Yeah, there we go.
so
So
here's
can you talk how
yeah,
that would
here's
work?
my pass on that. So I have been a meditation practitioner and on and off teacher for coming up on 30 years. And I think meditation is an incredibly powerful practice for improving focus and concentration. So meditation, in many ways, think about it, for the longest time, you learn meditation from teachers, you learned it from books. And then, lo and behold, somebody realized, Andy at Headspace, I think, was the first to say, I want to bring this to the masses. The way to bring it to the masses is actually through technology. And that was a good example of Headspace figured out a way. How do I take this ancient system that's really inaccessible for a lot of people and hard to get to, and make it accessible to the audience? So we see NeuroTrainer doing the same thing. The VR headset by itself is pretty cool. And cool is great because it attracts people and it's interesting. And we do, our relationship to technology it's such a large conversation. But I think the part that's important to us in this conversation is, as you mentioned earlier, a lot of the social network and our social engagement isn't really training attention, it's training inattention. That's the whole nature of things getting shorter. I can do a video in 5 seconds. I can do a video in 3 seconds. I don't need a video at all. I just stream all of my content. And what's literally happening there is we're training ourselves to get these little dopamine hits, these little reward hits from these short bursts of attention. So I have a 12-year-old. I have a 12-year-old boy. He's super smart. He's very active. And he loves information. But the way he loves information, we have a joke in the family that he loves, I call it hummingbird knowledge. So he like buzzes into the room and he's like, hey, Dad, did you know this? And then he buzzes out. And I'm always like, okay, but you don't understand the backstory. You don't understand how that fits in. Like, how about you actually research something? So this ability to manage your focus is this bridge point. And if people ask me, if we really back up and people say, what does NeuroTrainer do really well? What we do really well is we train focus. We train focus because focus is controllable. It's almost like an aperture. And there are times when we want our focus to be very broad. So think about driving a car. You want your focus to be very broad. You want to be picking up as much information as possible on a bicycle, in a car. Think about a jet fighter. There are times when you want your focus to be very narrow. So in that same metaphor, I'm driving and now I see something that really needs my attention. I want to be able to collapse my focus and then immediately open it up again. So let's talk about soccer. Soccer is probably exactly the same. There's moments where I need to see the whole field. I need to feel and see everything. And then suddenly there are these critical decision moments where I need to collapse my focus, ignore everything else, and execute. And then immediately go back to this wide focus again. So it happens when you're driving. It happens in soccer. Guess what? It happens in the classroom. It happens, you mentioned earlier, in your family. There are times when I want my attention to be very broad, and there's times when I just want to be paying attention to you, Joe. I need to give you 100% of my attention and let everything else tune out. So NeuroTrainer is a tool. There's lots of them out there, but it's a tool for training focus. And the reason that NeuroTrainer is so effective and meditation is so hard, just to not it's a direct comparison, but, and you've experienced this, is because when you put the headset on, we take over your visual field. Yes. You can't be distracted visually because you can't see anything else. Right. We actually take over most of your auditory sensations as well. So we've seen people, and you joke about it, it's a good thing you didn't hit the wall. We've seen people in environments, and you immediately get transported into something where all of your attention is right here. And we use the eyes to access the brain. So I think it's really helpful for people. Sometimes people who have trouble focusing find that when they use our system, it allows them to get to a sense of focus that's easier for them to replicate.
And I agree. And this kind of relates back to, is going to relate into my next question. When I was a college soccer coach, and I'm glad you kind of brought up Headspace. Not that this is, Headspace is a great tool, very accessible for a lot of, I use Headspace. But we used it with my team. And I can tell you, there were some, my players loved it, loved laying on the field, meditating. And some of my players, you'd observe them, and they would just be moving all the time, couldn't get comfortable. Sure. And it's hard. It isn't something that just comes naturally or comes easy, especially in our world today. But I do agree with you in terms of the focus that NeuroTrainer brings, because when I was performing in NeuroTrainer, they were still talking in the room, and I could hear them, but I couldn't tell you what they were talking about because my focus wasn't drawn to them. And I think that right there is a very anecdotal story, but very, I mean,
but it's very real. It's very real.
3 people in the room having a conversation, and I couldn't tell you. I could tell you that I missed a couple shots with the paddle trying to hit the robots, but I couldn't tell you what they were talking about. So,
sure.
My next.
Well, who wouldn't benefit if what we're saying is true? who wouldn't benefit from having increased ability to manage their focus?
Absolutely. I mean, I have that own issue right now in my own life. So,
Mhm.
and
And that's
I
why
think a lot of
we
people
get very excited about our product. I mean, you talk to me, you talk to the rest of the team. There's something so tangibly real about this idea that we can help people become masters of their own brains. And in a world where I do think distraction is the enemy, I think we're constantly fighting distraction. And we talk to coaches about this too. It's
yeah,
how it's much harder today. I think it's just simply true. It's much harder today to get your team to focus and practice than it was 20 years ago. And it's
100%.
because there's just so it's I have so much empathy for players today. There's so much more to distract them.
There's more distractions, and I would say more stress too, because
Hmm.
there's more, I think, just with how we've grown as a society, there's more pressure on
Yeah.
individuals to succeed on the field, in the classroom, in life, all this
Yeah, it
stuff.
starts
And
earlier as well.
yep,
Yeah.
yep. And so to be able to hone that focus, and also might bring a sense of relaxation in a way too, that meditation can bring too, because I think you're not multitasking your brain and putting your brain on into so many places. So,
Hmm.
um,
We
you know,
real quick, we
yeah,
work with
absolutely.
a coach. We work with a coach in Omaha, and in our discovery call. So we do a lot of. We're very. I want to say non-traditional sales organization because I've run some pretty traditional sales organizations, and so we spend a lot of time getting to know our potential customers and making sure that NeuroTrainer is going to be the right solution for them before we start a partnership. So we were talking, and he's a wrestling coach, and I was interested to see where he thought he would use NeuroTrainer. And we talked about priming and we talked about brain optimization, all the standard value propositions. He said one of the areas he sees that it's potentially really helpful is before matches, he's got players whose minds completely work against them. They're sitting there in meditation. We call this rumination. They're sitting there and they're just ruminating mentally. And instead of kind of like being able to get in the zone and I'm the king, their heads working against them. And he's tried different tools to try to distract them from that. And he's convinced that if I just put him in the headset and have them do attention flow even for 5 minutes, it'll break them free of that what in meditation they call the monkey mind.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's an interesting way of looking at, okay, here's a tool. What are the different ways that I can use it in order
And
for it to be effective?
I think all coaches and athletes will come up with, I think neurotrainers flexible in a way enough that they can
Hmm.
come up with it that will best suit them. And so
Hmm.
that kind of leads me into my next question, kind of off of some of the stories you've already told us, like myself and some of the UWS staff and several of our players who had the opportunity to try out the NeuroTrainer software with the Oculus hardware.
Hmm.
And I know this has been in the hands of many different sports teams and athletes. Um, but is this something that coaches and athletic departments at the college level should consider? And the reason I ask this
Hmm.
is I worked as a head coach for a high school team. I've worked as a head coach for a college team. We have certain budgets we have to follow, but is NeuroTrainer, and I know that you don't control the Oculus hardware, but is this a viable option financially, for like how many headsets would you say, like a soccer team of 24,
Sure.
would a coach reasonably be able to use, and without breaking their budget? Is this a
Right.
financially viable option for these lower level teams, not necessarily the professional teams?
Right. I think it's a very fair question. So as you mentioned, we're a software company. We're not a hardware company. So the Oculus Quest, we see them there. There's one behind me. The Quest headset is an off-the-shelf product. We think it is from a VR perspective for your dollar the most advanced, affordable consumer products, incredibly reliable, owned by Facebook. So it's $300 to grab a headset. The way we set up a team is every individual on the team has a 4-digit PIN. So if you have 2 headsets, if you have 4 headsets as a team or as an organization, I can pick up any headset, enter my 4-digit PIN, NeuroTrainer knows who I am, and immediately I get that curated experience. So the answer to your question is, I think NeuroTrainer itself, I think, is priced very reasonably. Very often people are surprised at how reasonably NeuroTrainer is priced. But then when we look at how many headsets do I need, it's just a question of logistics. And it's just a question of figuring out how do you fit it in. And so what we're seeing in terms of, we're always looking for success models that we can scale, is what we're seeing is, what do you do for warm-ups now? And so very often warm-ups are modular. You don't have everybody doing the same thing at the same time. Okay, so how do we work this in? So is it, if we can get your athletes, we always say we like to get athletes training 3 times a week. That's by the way, not some magic science number. NeuroTrainer, so cognitive training, brain training, isn't like S&C training. If I go and I do a heavy day of squats, I really should not do a heavy day of squats the next day, because my muscles need a chance to recover. My joints need a chance to recover. The brain is incredibly resilient, and we're actually not stressing it that much in a 10-minute session. So you could do NeuroTrainer every day, and we've had athletes do that. But let's say you're going to shoot for doing it 2 or 3 times a week, baking it in to existing programs and then just rotating through. So you'll have half the team doing dynamic warm-up, half the team doing NeuroTrainer, doing cognitive warm-up, then you switch, would be an example. And we've worked with partners who get this down so meticulously that they just schedule it out, and the athlete knows exactly when they're supposed to have access to the headset. They get their session in, they rotate through. So I think, in answer to your question, easily you can get through with 4 headsets with a team that size. And so the headsets are a one-time commitment. And
I've spent more money when I was on than
in shoes.
Yeah, well, in everything.
Right.
I spent more money in t-shirts than what the Oculus. And I did actually, my girlfriend and I talked about getting an Oculus after we used the NeuroTrainer app, because I thought it was so cool. I thought it'd be a really good addition to some of the things that we do in our off time. And I hadn't even tried any other apps other than the NeuroTrainer, and the price point isn't bad, especially considering what a lot of other technology costs out there.
Yeah.
In today's world. So my final question before I let you go, and kind of more of an open-ended question about NeuroTrainer, but about cognitive priming and neuroplasticity, is what does the future hold for all this stuff, for NeuroTrainer, cognitive priming, the study of neuroplasticity, not just in the world of sport, because I think we've talked a lot about that, but what about in the world of academics, the world of healthcare? It's on and on and on, because obviously we've talked about how it can have a lot of different benefits. Like, where do you imagine the future going, or where would it's hard to predict.
I get it.
The future,
no, I get it, Joe. Yeah.
Where would you like
so you're asking the president of a tech company to think about the future? Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
What am I going to do?
Yeah, so probably the only thing you think about every single day.
So this year, so we've been in sports now for a couple of years, and we'll continue to be in sports. Sports is our beachhead. Obviously, we mentioned we're doing some work with the DoD. Some of that is on performance as it relates to training aviators. Some of it is tactical operators. But this idea of how does NeuroTrainer impact academic performance is definitely on our radar. And we're working both in Omaha and outside of Omaha to get a couple of case studies or pilots behind us this year that start to get some real proof around NeuroTrainer's ability to improve academic performance. That's very important to us, and we think that'll be very powerful. We've talked about TBI and TBI recovery. That's inside NeuroTrainer labs. If and when we continue to develop this idea of priming for learning, you can imagine how that starts to open up beyond sports and even beyond academics. Think of all the corporations that spend time, money, and energy training their staff. What if we can improve the overall efficiency and effectiveness of that training? What if we can do it if we can help aviators in the Navy, how can we help commercial pilots? So we get very excited because it starts to get very, very big and very broad for us. But in the near future, we're going deep in this idea of cognitive priming, starting to really develop tools that allow us to potentially customize the priming experience, tools that allow us to be able to be even more responsive to the athlete so that we get the timing right and the level of intensity right. So it feels very, very personalized and more efficient. We're always looking for more efficiency. And then when we look further down the road and we think about where the technology is going, and it gets pretty exciting and hard to predict, but currently we're in VR. I think everybody in VR is looking at augmented reality and the fusion of virtual reality and augmented reality. And so then imagine that, and you see it, like when you put the headset on now, in the beginning, you can still see everything in monochrome, right? It's kind of trippy and weird. It's like, oh, I can still see my world. So now imagine you're on the field and we have you prime and do a task, and then suddenly you can see everything in front of you as well. And now you can actually interact with a soccer ball, or you can interact with agility cones while still in the headset, so that we can superimpose cognitive tasks and challenges with the real world. that's what everybody in VR and this level of technology dreams about. And we're going to get there. We're going to see some of those products come online in the next year. They're going to be really expensive, but it's always the case, right? Remember the first laptop? Wow, it was so expensive. They're never going to be affordable.
My dad had the first iPod. He still has it, I think, just out of posterity, because it's like, it's about the size of a
I can beat that.
brick right now.
So. I can beat that. I grew up. My father was a salesman in the telecommunications industry. We had one of the very first answering machines, and it weighed 35 pounds. I kid you not. It was
perfect.
It was a boat anchor.
Well, that's great. I think the one thing that has me very interested with my background in kinesiology and sports medicine, but also in sport, is I've loved sports psychology, and I love like the advantages athletes can gain from this or gain from other things. But then I love diving into this and where this could, like, cognitive priming, and where things like NeuroTrainer could take athletes and our brain to the next level. So those are kind of all my questions. Thank you for joining me today. It was very, very informative.
It was a pleasure.
I'm excited for the individuals who tuned in live to watch online, and I'm excited for the individuals who get to watch this later. And my guest today again was Noah Rolland, president of NeuroTrainer, very hands-on president. I haven't ever interviewed a president for a tech company. If you would have asked me if I would have been doing that when I've been talking soccer, I would have told you which tech company and all that stuff. So this was a great opportunity for me. I was happy to use NeuroTrainer, and I hope to use it again. And I'm excited to see the future of the company and the science of where this goes. So thank you again, Noah. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Joe. It was an absolute pleasure, and we're really looking forward to this opportunity. It's going to be really interesting to be able to work with these players and be very. I mean, we are very hands-on, boots on the ground. So we're always looking for feedback, and we're always looking for new customer, new partnership opportunities. So, and Omaha has been very good to us. We're San Francisco based, but we actually have more customers in Omaha than any place else in the United States. So
awesome. That's great.
as soon as I'm on the other side of vaccines, we'll meet, because I have a big trip planned for Nebraska, and we'll have to get face to face.
Please let me know when you're in Omaha. That'd be great.
Fantastic.
Have a good night.
Thanks. You take care.
Bye. And that was Noah Rolland, president of NeuroTrainer. Thank you, Noah, for coming on again to the show. A very informative episode, and I would encourage everyone to watch it back if you didn't catch everything, because there's a lot of good information that can help your students, your athletes, your families. But also, NeuroTrainer is going to make a huge impact on the GEA UWS team this summer and our high-performing athletes, who are then going to return to the college game and hopefully build on the performances and the successes that they have on the field today. I want to give a quick thank you to some other people. I want to give a quick thank you to Aaron, who ran the board for us today and also created all those videos you saw on the side. He's kind of been my partner in crime with the TV or the show that we've been putting out on YouTube and all the help with that. And so it's going to keep getting better and better, the production levels, because of his involvement. Thank you, Sarah Anderson, for helping us set up the interview with the partnership and all that. And then thank you to the Nebraska players who are involved. I thought I couldn't tell everyone when they're in their Oculus headsets and their masks, but I saw Reagan and Katie and Kenzie, I believe. And I know there was a fourth one, and I'm not sure who that was. So I apologize, but thank you to them for creating the content for us and enjoying NeuroTrainer like I did. And with that is the end of this episode. Make sure you tune in next week. We're going to have probably one or two more episodes of our preseason and our build up to the season. Then we're going to take a couple weeks off, and then the next time you see me when you see me in May, it's going to be all GEA UWS soccer all the time, every single week, with updates, highlights, and interviews from players and coaches. Have a good night, everyone.